Thank you, Glenn. It's a real pleasure to be here just uh, addressing this August group. Uh, my books represent the first comprehensive study focused on the 5th Texas Regiment and the exploits and experiences of its brave men. Given its remarkable record as part of Robert E. Lee's shock troops through 4 years of war, I found this story long overdue and greatly in need of telling. The 5th Texas was comprised of 10 companies organized with colorful names, which reflected their individual histories, such as the Bayou City Guards, the Leon Hunters, the Dixie Blues, Company Invincibles, and Polk County Flying Artillery. The Bayou City Guards was organized in Harris County, Texas, obviously, and mustered into Confederate service in July of 1861. Before boarding the trains to head to training camp, the unit marched through downtown Houston. A businessman there distributed a box of white gloves, which the men supposedly fastened to their bayonets when they were marching down Main Street, and thus earned them the nickname the Kid Glove Gentry. Among the men of this company were D.C. Farmer, who was a 25-year-old teacher when he joined the Bayou City Guards and was elected as 3rd lieutenant and later promoted to captain. He was again promoted to major in October of 1863 and was the unit's acting lieutenant colonel that December. He was wounded at Gettysburg and again at the Wilderness, and he soon thereafter returned to Texas on recruiting duty for the duration of the war. Walter Brown Botts was born in Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1835 and graduated from the Virginia Military Institute and studied law in Virginia, and then moved to Houston in 1857, where he set up a law practice there. He enlisted in the Bayou City Guards in July of 1861 and was elected its original captain. Following an extended illness, he returned to Texas and resumed his law practice, forming one of Texas's well-known law firms, Baker and Botts. He died in 1894 in Houston. Pelcher Hugh Fuller was born in 1836 in North Carolina and moved to Houston in 1843. He became a member of the Washington Light Guards prior to the war, while also practicing law there. His sister, Matilda Jane Fuller Young, made the famous battle flag for the regiment and was known as the mother of Hood's Texas Brigade. Fuller himself was elected the 3rd lieutenant of the Bayou City Guards and later was its 1st lieutenant. He was seriously wounded at the Wilderness. Following the war, he returned home to his law practice and died there in 1876. Echo Company was later designated as Company B and was recruited from Colorado County and enlisted into service in August of 1861. Among its members were John Cunningham Upton, who was born in Franklin County, Tennessee in 1828. After panning for gold in California, Upton took charge of his mother's plantation in Colorado County. He raised the company there and was elected its captain. Soon promoted to lieutenant colonel, he served bravely throughout the conflict. He was known for wearing a red undershirt into battle and for his unorthodox battle tactics. He was killed at Second Manassas. The Waverly Confederates were organized by Robert Macajah Powell in July of 1861 from Waverly, Walker, and Montgomery counties, and ultimately became Company D that fall. Powell, born in Montgomery County, Alabama in 1826, moved to Montgomery County, Texas in 1849 and settled in Brenham, where he established a busy law practice there. Elected to the Texas House in 1857, he was a strong advocate for secession. He was also a strong proponent for Texas's fighting in Virginia, and once the war began, and was elected captain in of the Waverly Confederates. He was later wounded on the field of Gettysburg and taken prisoner and spent the next 16 months as a prisoner of war. Released in January of 1865, he took command of the Texas Brigade as its senior colonel. Following the war, he returned to Maryland, working as a merchant and cotton broker. In 1882, he relocated to St. Louis and died there in 1916. John Marcus Smither, who was only 17 years old when he joined, helped to organize the company and quickly rose through the ranks, becoming its sergeant major. As such, he was in the thick of every fight until being wounded at Chickamauga. After quickly recovering from these wounds, he continued fighting until he surrendered at Appomattox. He then returned to Waverly following the war at only 21 years old and served for many years as a local judge there. He's buried in Oakwood Cemetery, very near here, and we put a flag on his grave yesterday. The Dixie Blues from Washington County were organized by John D. Rogers in July of 1861 and ultimately became Company E. Among these men were John Harrison Roberts, who was born in 1845 on a farm in San Augustine, Texas. When he enlisted in Dixie Blues, he was only 15 years old. He was wounded in both legs at Gettysburg and was captured and imprisoned in a succession of Union prisoner of war camps. Roberts later married a descendant of Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition and moved to the Liverpool area where he engaged in farming and ranching. He also ran a general store there where he sold goods from his farm. He died in February of 1934. Bowling Eldridge was born in 1839 in Halifax, Virginia, and arrived in Texas in 1850 with his parents. He enlisted in 1861, rising to lieutenant, was wounded twice, and finally surrendered at Appomattox. In 1867, he started a grocery business in Brenham, which he operated until his death. He died in that town on October 29th, 1938, holding the distinction of being the last survivor of Hood's Texas Brigade. The company Invincibles was organized in Liberty County in July of 1861 and later designated as Company F. It consisted of 146 men initially, among them Dallas King Bryant, its first commander, who was born in 1818 of Irish descent in St. Mary's Parish, Louisiana. And he moved to Texas in 1834. He and his two brothers all fought at San Jacinto. He was later sheriff of Liberty County and was serving in the Texas legislature at the outbreak of the war. Seriously wounded at Gettysburg and then in both arms of the Wilderness, he was forced to resign in March of 1865. Never recovering from those wounds, he died in Liberty in 1866. James E. Cobb was practicing law and teaching school prior to the war. He enlisted in the Invincibles as a private and became its lieutenant in 1862. Captured at Gettysburg, he became one of the immortal 600 captive officers who were sent to Charleston Harbor to act as human shields. After 22 months in several federal prisons, he was finally paroled in May of 1865. Thereafter became a prominent member of the U.S. Congress from Alabama and later taught law and was the editor of the Tuskegee News. He died in New Mexico in 1903. William A. Fletcher from Beaumont served in the 5th Texas until injuries required him to ride, whereupon he joined the 8th Texas Cavalry. Following the war, he became wealthy in the lumber business. He also wrote a book of his wartime experiences, Rebel Private Front and Rear, in 1908 and died in 1915. The Texas Aids was organized in Washington County and ultimately consisted of 145 men. Organized by Jerome Bonaparte Robertson in July of 1861, it eventually became Company I of the unit. Robertson, from Independence, first commanded the unit and was later the commander of the Texas Brigade. Following a degree in medicine from Transylvania University, he joined the Army of the Republic of Texas in 1836. Thereafter, Robertson settled on Washington on the Brazos and became a respected physician and Indian fighter. He served in the Texas House and Senate and was a delegate to the Texas Secession Convention. During the war, he commanded the 5th Texas and then the entire brigade from November of 1862 until the spring of 1865, where he got sideways with his superiors. Thereafter, he served in various positions in the Trans-Mississippi Department. Following the war, Robertson managed real estate and promoted railroads in West Texas. He and his son Felix were the only two father and son Confederate generals other than the Lees. Tacitus T. Clay was born in 1824 in Davis County, Kentucky. In 1828, his father moved the family to Austin's colony, homesteading at Cole's Settlement, later named Independence. In 1859, he was elected mayor of Independence. Jerome B. Robertson, a good friend and neighbor, requested Clay join the Texas Aids, and he became its captain in October of '61. Thereafter, he served as acting colonel of the regiment in several major engagements. Wounded at the Wilderness and again at Darbytown Road, with this latter injury requiring the amputation of his leg. He ultimately returned to Independence, where he died in 1868, never having recovered from those wounds. Benjamin Sims Fitzgerald was born in Johnson County, North Carolina in 1828 and later settled in Independence. He taught school at Baylor's Males Department before the war and enlisted in the Company I in March of 1882. Following Appomattox, he again taught at Baylor and was a dealer in religious books. During that time, he was also the immigration agent for the Houston and Texas Railway. Fitzgerald also owned a very successful lumber company, and he died in 1908. The Polk County Flying Artillery was organized in Livingston County with 140 men and 2 6-pound cannon donated by Joseph Turner, the father of Ike Turner. Ike and his uncle organized the unit in September of 1861. The unit changed its branch to infantry in order to enter the war sooner. Interestingly enough, Polk County furnished more soldiers than it had voters. 900 volunteers versus 600 voters. Among its men was Isaac Newton Ike Turner, not related to Tina, elected captain at age 22. So he became the youngest of the Texas Brigade's original commanders and soon enjoyed a reputation as a daredevil. He promised to at a farewell dinner, he promised to bring the men back to Texas as heroes. Turner was born in Turnbull Plantation in Putnam County, Georgia in 1839. His father, a veteran of the Texas War of Independence, purchased considerable land in Polk and Liberty counties and entrusted Ike to oversee the holdings while the remainder of the family remained in Georgia. Once the war commenced, with the loss of field grade officers at both 2nd Manassas and Sharpsburg, Ike temporarily assumed command of the entire regiment. Following Sharpsburg, he was breveted major with the understanding that he form a battalion of sharpshooters. He was individually honored at Fredericksburg with a dress parade by General Robertson for his gallantry. It was said of him that he was a brave and daring officer, quick to observe any advantage in position, prompt to take action thereunder, frequently assuming command of part or all of the regiment when his superiors were absent. On April 14, 1863, he was killed inside Fort Huger while standing on the parapets during the Suffolk campaign. The entire brigade lamented his untimely passing, particularly General Hood, who has stated that he would sooner have lost any other officer in his command. Hood later told General Lee that a more noble and brave soldier had not fallen during the entire war. The 5th Texas Infantry was one of only 3 infantry units from Texas to fight in the East as part of the Army of Northern Virginia. Its 10 companies came from counties in east central Texas centered around Huntsville and were organized throughout the summer of 1861, training near Houston late that summer. The regiment was comprised in significant part by sons of veterans of the Texas War of Independence, and in a number of cases by those who actually served in that war. After training in Texas, the 5th departed Richmond in the fall of 1861 for Dumfries, Virginia, about 30 miles south of Washington, to guard against any Union southward movement there. There, that first winter, they suffered terrible losses, not on the battlefield, but due to diseases. In close quarters, suffering in the bitter cold winter, unlike what they were used to, they were vulnerable to diseases such as measles, pneumonia, and dysentery. Sadly, the regiment lost over 260 men to disease that first winter. Being 1,500 miles from home created particular hardships not experienced to the same degree by other troops, particularly once the Mississippi River was firmly in federal hands. Food, clothing, sundries, and even letters from home were scarce. While the men grumbled, as all soldiers are prone to do, they remained a well-oiled fighting machine. They were always prepared to fight to the last measure, leading Lee to once proudly proclaim that the Texans are always ready. At 2nd Manassas on August 30th, 1862, the regiment acquired its famous nickname. In its front, the 10th New York, known as the National Zouaves, operated a skirmish line, currently exchanging fire with them. 200 yards to the rear, near a large battery, the 5th New York, known as Dury's Zouaves, rested in a reserve near a low ridge with the woods in their front. The New Yorkers were led by Colonel Gouverneur K. Warren. This was the same regiment that had traded vicious and well-remembered taunts and insults with the 5th Texas across the Potomac that prior winter at Dumfries. The 5th New York sported collarless dark blue jackets, vests trimmed in red, blue-trimmed red sashes, baggy red trousers tucked into white canvas leggings, and red fezzes with short gold tassels. As the Texas Brigade emerged from the woods that day, it covered a line over 700 yards long, with the 5th Texas on their far right. Before moving out, Captain John Smith Cleveland, pointing to the regiment's unique Lone Star and Bars flag, exhorted the men to cling to it, boys, as you would your sweethearts. Soon, rank after rank emerged from the cover of the trees, yelling their loudest, particularly face-to-face with the Zouaves. The 10th New York fired one volley and promptly scrambled for the rear. When within 100 yards of the Federals, after scattering the 10th New York, the men of the 5th were ordered to fix bayonets, fire, and charge. The Texans were soon upon Colonel Warren's second line of defense, the 5th New York Zouaves. When the 10th New York fled, it began pouring past and through the 5th New York's line, with the Texans close on their heels. The 5th New York could not fire while the 10th New York was still coming through their ranks. The 5th Texas, however, maintained a rapid fire while advancing, screaming the rebel yell. Finally, in utter desperation, the 5th New York commenced firing, even while some of their fellow New Yorkers were still scrambling through their ranks. While the New Yorkers' first volley went high, merely scattering leaves on the Texans responded with effective fire. The Zouaves, standing in the open, made easy targets, particularly with their very distinctive uniforms. During this exchange, Colonel Upton grabbed the colors in his left hand and, with a drawn saber in his right, yelled, "Come on, boys, follow us." Immediately thereafter, he was shot in the head and killed. The 5th New York quickly began to unravel before the relentless attack of 5th Texas. It soon became hopeless butchery, one veteran later recalled. The New Yorkers began scrambling to the rear in disjointed groups, not stopping until reaching Henry Hill. The 5th New York commander, Colonel Warren, rode back to the rear and, in a trembling voice, with tears in his eyes, reported to Drewry's son, "Jake, the old 5th has been annihilated." Only 40 minutes before, the 5th New York had numbered over 500 men. On Henry Hill, less than an hour later, there was initially only 60 men there present. One Texan, describing the hillside, littered with the dead, dying, and wounded Zouaves, indicated that the variegated colors of the peculiar uniforms gave the scene the appearance of a Texas hillside in spring, painted with wildflowers of every hue and color. This carnage was one of the largest losses of life in a single battle for an infantry regiment on either side during the entire war. Flushed with this victory, the regiment surged through 3 more disintegrating Federal lines, outdistancing not only the remainder of the brigade, but the rest of Lee's army as well. After the battle, Corps Commander Longstreet questioned then Brigade Commander John Bell Hood as to the whereabouts of his 5th Texas. Hood replied they had slipped the bridle and were on their way to Washington. Longstreet nodded, knowingly said, "If any men in the world can get there, those are the men." Their actions that day earned the regiment the nickname the Bloody 5th. However, the regiment's accomplishments that day came with a frightening butcher's bill. At the end of the fight, 3 companies had no officers remaining, and every single field grade officer was a casualty. 7 color bearers fell carrying the regiment's flag that day. The 5th Texas, the most engaged in the fighting, lost over 260 men, the highest casualty rate in Lee's army that day. Bolstered by a success at Second Manassas, Confederate authorities decided to advance into Pennsylvania in order to isolate Washington from the rest of the North and possibly gain foreign recognition. Thus, the 5th Texas next found itself in Maryland, a small, sleepy town called Sharpsburg. Here, the Texas Brigade held off 2 Federal corps supported by 6 batteries of artillery for over 4 hours in confined areas such as Miller's Cornfield, the East Woods, and the Dunker Church. The brigade suffered a 64% casualty rate there, with the 5th Texas itself going into the fray with only 175 men and losing 86 of them. That winter of 1862 found the soldiers subsisting on reduced rations, while a scarcity of forage for the horses caused them to die from this lack of grain and grass. Thus, Lee planned to pin down a sizable Union garrison at Suffolk in southern Virginia, forcing the Army of the Potomac's commander, Joseph Hooker, to dispatch a portion of his army southward. Lee also planned a simultaneous massive foraging expedition west and south of Suffolk. The Texans' foraging efforts were remarkable, resulting in huge quantities of grain and fodder being gathered and stored. Somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million pounds of bacon were so secured. Corporal John Stevens of the unit remarked, "We just swam in bacon with massive trains hauling out bacon, corn, wheat, flour, and great droves of beeves. By the spring of 1863, the Texas Brigade had become part of Major John Bell Hood's division of Longstreet's First Corps. Brigadier General Robertson commanded the brigade, and Colonel Micajah Powell became commander of the 5th Texas. Soon plans were underway to invade the North yet again. The regiment left camp on June 13th, bivouacked that first night at Cedar Mountain Battlefield among the still unburied bones. After crossing the Potomac at Williamsport on June 25th, the regiment marched into Maryland, and ending that evening at Greencastle, Pennsylvania. One veteran wrote that the regiment that day enjoyed breakfast in Virginia, lunch in Maryland, and supper in Pennsylvania. Another man, commenting on the captured Federal whiskey on which many of the men had imbibed, indicated that the regiment was actually in 4 states that day, including the state of intoxication. Excuse me. After a successful first day of fighting on July 1st, 1863, Lee held the town of Gettysburg, although it was not the battleground of his choosing. Battle plans for the next day called for rolling up the Federal left flank before its new commander, George Gordon Meade, could fully concentrate his entire force on the heights at Cemetery Ridge. The plan called for Longstreet positioning his men on the Emmitsburg Road and hitting the Federal left at an angle. Major General Lafayette McLaws' division was to spearhead the attack, with Hood following en echelon, thus allowing the attack to gather strength as the movement progressed. While this flank attack exhibited great potential, Lee was far too late in launching it. Longstreet was far too late in launching it. Longstreet had waited half the day for the arrival of General Evander Law's brigade. Thereafter, his pace to the jump-off point was still extremely slow, and halfway through the march, when he determined that his men could be seen from the Federal signal station atop Little Round Top, he halted the march and retraced his route almost back to the beginning and began yet again. Due to this lack of progress for much of the day, the Union Army had ample time to consolidate. General Daniel Sickles had led his 3rd Corps forward to the Emmitsburg Road, occupying the peach orchard. Federal troops and artillery were also shifted as far as the rocks on Devil's Den and Little Round Top. When Longstreet finally arrived at the jump-off point, he discovered the intended battle plan would no longer work. Instead of moving up the Emmitsburg Road, Hood would have to move half a mile to the south and then attack straight ahead toward Little Round Top. The regiment thus faced a next to impossible task, that of taking Little Round Top following its recent occupation by the Federals. Tasked with venturing over a rocky field for over a mile, then climbing boulder-studded hill while being pummeled by rock and grape from Federal cannon positioned to the left at Devil's Den, with sharpshooters in their immediate front, as well as Union troops firing from the protection of the steep heights. General Hood heartily believed in some kind of an alternative plan. After several unsuccessful pleas, and finally a formal protest by Hood, all of which were rejected by Longstreet, the men went forward nonetheless. The 5th Texas fought off Federal sharpshooters and traversed the wooded and extremely rocky terrain leading to Little Round Top. In the process, they had to negotiate trees, underbrush, and massive boulders the size of small houses. The blaze from Federal fire was devastating, and the regiment soon lost its color sergeant as well as its next 3 color bearers. Despite the desperate nature of their situation and suffering horrific losses, the men of the 5th never despaired, but gave their all to surmount those heights, making 3 valiant attempts to take the seemingly insurmountable hill. Their final attempt nearly succeeded, despite the overwhelming odds against them. The regiment, along with 3 others, broke to the right of the Union position atop the rocky ledge and was engaged in close-quarter combat there. It was actually forcing the Federals from their position atop the heights when another Federal brigade finally arrived on the scene, saving the day for the Union at the last possible moment. The persistent 5th Texas suffered terribly for its efforts that day, more than any other regiment, entering the battle with 409 men and losing 211 of them, or 52%, including 112 men captured. The regiment never fully recovered from this slaughter at Gettysburg. With a major fight brewing in the Western Theater, and the Texans still recovering from its Gettysburg casualties, Confederate authorities decide to send Longstreet's corps south to Georgia to assist General Braxton Bragg, whose force there was considerably outnumbered. This journey ended up taking 9 days of travel over 8 different railroads with 8 transfer points, covering a distance of over 900 miles. The 5th Texas arrived in Ringgold, Georgia on September 18th, just in time to participate in the initial fighting there at Chickamauga on September 19th. While gaining ground that day, the depleted Texas force was finally halted by Federal artillery in superior numbers. On September 20th, the Texans were ordered to a new attack position. After charging the enemy with a much smaller force, they were able to pour through a 1/2 mile gap in the Union line, forcing a Union retreat. Many of its officers lay wounded at Snodgrass Hill, including Captain Cleveland, who had charged forward carrying the regimental flag. One Texan later wrote that the battle and the area where it was fought was the meanest, most unsatisfactory place I struck in the whole war. After the success at Chickamauga, following the retreating Union Army back to Chattanooga, the Confederates engaged in several protracted fights, including a major night fight at Wauhatchie, north of Lookout Mountain, on October 29th. Soon thereafter, Longstreet received the independent command for which he long lobbied and headed northeastward to engage Burnside's 9th Corps before it could join forces with General Thomas, then in overall command at Chattanooga. Following a series of engagements with the Federals, including an unsuccessful effort to capture Knoxville, Tennessee, Longstreet's corps, including the 5th Texas, began preparations for a winter encampment in the mountains of East Tennessee around Morristown. Extremely ill-equipped and ill-supplied, the men were forced to suffer terribly that winter of 1863 in the deep mountain snows. Many fought half naked or with nothing but ragged and threadbare uniforms. Soon thereafter, the Texans were reunited with the rest of the army in early 1864. Lee's men found themselves virtually with their backs to the wall at the Wilderness on May 6th and were about to be hopelessly overrun. Longstreet's corps, with the Texas Brigade in the lead, was desperately rushing at the double quick to join the fight in order to stem the tide. At the seemingly last moment, the Texans broke into the clearing in front of the oncoming Federals. A highly agitated General Lee ordered the Texans forward and to give them cold steel. The current Texas Brigade commander, John Gregg, shouted, "Attention, Texas Brigade, the eyes of General Lee are upon you," and ordered them forward. As the men advanced, Lee attempted to lead them into the battle, waving his hat and shouting, "Texans always move them." Aware of the obvious danger to their beloved leader, the men of the 5th Texas at once surrounded Lee. Mounted on his horse near the general, Courier Leonard G. of the 5th Texas uttered in a choking voice, with tears streaming down his face, "I would charge hell itself for that old man." G. then grabbed the bridle of Lee's mount, halting the horse as the men shouted, "General Lee to the rear." Only after they pledged to drive the enemy back would Lee finally agree to retire. With Lee finally safe behind the lines, the Texans charged down the Orange Plank Road, sweeping the enemy before them in a savage hail of lead and grape. This advance turned the tide of the battle, thus impeding Grant's grand movement south. The redoubtable regiment and its brigade had saved Lee's army once again. The cost of their victory was almost more than the unit could bear, however. Entering the fray with 100 officers and men, 111 of them fell within 25 minutes. The 5th Texas lost its commander, along with every one of its regimental officers. Thereafter, Grant continued attempting to slip southward around Lee's army. Following the Battle of Spotsylvania, he orchestrated a frontal assault on Lee's lines, losing 7,000 men in half an hour at Cold Harbor. Thereafter, the regiment took up its position in the defensive trenches surrounding Richmond in the summer of 1864. There it suffered 5 dozen additional casualties in the Petersburg siege following before it surrendered at Appomattox. In all, the 5th Texas fought in 38 major engagements, including just about every significant battle in the East, with the exception of Chancellorsville. Additionally, it was a primary factor in the Confederacy's brilliant victory at Chickamauga, as well as a series of other engagements in the Western Theater. The men of the 5th Texas remained always ready and eager to enter the thick of the fighting, despite the odds, and never showed the enemy their backs. As the war lingered on, faced with a lack of clothing, shoes, and ultimately food, they nonetheless maintained their devotion to their cause and a faith that they would ultimately prevail, and never despaired. Their elan and fighting spirit continued throughout the war. When the future seemed hopeless in the spring of 1865, even Lee's army experienced high desertion rates. However, there were none in the 5th Texas. Such men were hard to come by. At Appomattox, it held the position of thwarting any Federal assault on what remained of the army. There at Appomattox, the regiment surrendered a total of 13 officers and 148 men, all of whom had to find their own way home to Texas from Virginia. During the war, it had suffered 303 men killed in battle, 280 dead of disease, and 663 wounded. In many respects, their resoluteness typified the motto on the streamer atop their flag, "Venere sat vincere," to live long enough is to conquer. While they did not win their war, they achieved their conquest was in achieving eternal glory in the annals of history. I wish to thank you for sharing some of my enthusiasm of the fabled 5th Texas. I appreciate your attention, and I welcome any questions you might have. Thank you.